What if a billionaire was allergic to beautiful women, but fell in love with a 70-year-old librarian who saw his soul? This is the unbelievable true story of Julian Cross, a man the world mocked until he turned his pain into power. A story of scandal, redemption, and a love that defied every rule. Trust us, you won't want to miss a second of this. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories. Julian Cross sat motionless in his minimalist penthouse high above the glittering sprawl of Manhattan. The city buzzed with life below, but in his silent, sterile world of glass and marble, there was only stillness. His reflection stared back at him from the floor-to-ceiling window. Chiseled features, flawless skin, thick, dark hair swept perfectly to the side. To the world, he was perfection incarnate. Tech mogul, billionaire, boy genius turned man of power. But behind those cold, intelligent eyes hid a truth that gnawed at him every second of every day. Julian Cross could not love. Not in the way the world expected, at least. It began when he was 20 at one of his family's signature galas, opulent affairs where the air reeked of champagne and superficial charm. His father, Gregory Cross, a titan of industry and legacy, had introduced him to Vivienne d'Amour, daughter of a European banking magnate. She was beauty incarnate, elegant, graceful, lips curved like calligraphy. The moment Julian looked into her eyes, his chest tightened. He tried to smile, to speak, but his skin turned clammy. His heart thundered in his chest, and sweat soaked through his tuxedo. Before he could utter a word, he was gasping for air, knees buckling beneath him. He collapsed. Doctors rushed to the scene. Panic ensued. Later, the diagnosis was vague: panic attack, perhaps brought on by stress. But it happened again. And again. Always around women society deemed stunning, models, actresses, debutantes. Even an AIA robot with hyper-realistic feminine features once triggered his symptoms during a tech expo. His parents dismissed it at first. "Get some rest," his mother, Cynthia, had said with a soft pat on the shoulder. "You're just tired." Gregory was less gentle. "You're a Cross, damn it. Act like one." Julian tried. He dated, he smiled through dinners with women who could grace magazine covers, forced himself to hold their hands, to pretend he felt nothing crawling under his skin when they leaned too close. But the truth was undeniable. His body betrayed him every time. Rashes, accelerated heart rate, trembling, and once even a seizure. No doctor could explain it. One psychiatrist suggested it was a rare form of psychosomatic trauma response, a subconscious association between beauty and danger. Another diagnosed him with perfection-induced dissociative reaction, a term so absurd Julian wanted to punch the man through his clipboard. Therapy didn't help. Hypnosis failed. Medications dulled his senses but didn't stop the episodes. He tried everything short of electroshock. And society didn't care. The public wasn't interested in nuance or rare psychological afflictions. They wanted sound bites. They wanted drama. Julian Cross became the punchline to a joke he never told. Rumors swirled. Was he gay? Was he asexual? Was he just a cruel narcissist who toyed with women's hearts and fled? Tabloids feasted on the mystery. Memes surfaced of him fleeing fashion models like they were zombies. Beauty-phobic trended more than once. Late-night hosts had a field day. He buried himself in work. Tech was the only world that didn't demand romantic perfection. He could lose himself in algorithms, in building the future, in creating machines that did exactly what he told them. Machines didn't judge. They didn't pout when he panicked. They didn't look disappointed when he flinched at a simple touch. But even that sanctuary began to crumble. During a live product launch in Tokyo, a female celebrity guest reached for his arm in a playful gesture. Cameras caught the exact moment his face drained of color. Within seconds, he staggered off stage, eyes wide in terror, lungs failing him. The video racked up millions of views overnight. Julian Cross, the man who built a quantum internet, who revolutionized drone travel, who had been on the cover of Time, was now just that guy who has a meltdown when women touch him. His board grew nervous. Investors grew distant. At one particularly brutal meeting, a new board member smirked and said, "We're not selling computers anymore, we're selling drama." Julian said nothing. He let them talk. He let them speculate. But inside, he was cracking, splintering. Because what none of them knew, what he barely admitted to himself, was how badly he wanted to feel something real. It wasn't that he didn't want love. He craved it in the quiet hours, in the stillness after midnight when the only sound was the hum of servers. He wanted to hold someone and not feel his skin crawl. He wanted to laugh with a woman and not feel that rising panic in his chest. He wanted to be normal. But the world didn't let people like him be normal. One night, he stood in front of his bathroom mirror, eyes hollow, knuckles white, as he gripped the sink. "What's wrong with me?" he whispered. No answer came, only the echo of the question bouncing back at him from marble walls. He didn't date anymore, didn't attend events. His assistants fielded all requests. His penthouse, once a symbol of power and vision, became a fortress. He fired 3 bodyguards because one of them joked about hiring an escort just to see what happens. He saw no one, spoke to no one beyond the necessary. Even his mother, once his greatest advocate, had stopped calling. His father's final message had been curt. "You're on your own, son. We can't carry your embarrassment anymore." It stung more than he wanted to admit. And then there were the nights. The long, aching hours between 2 and 5 a.m. where he would lie awake in a bed too large for one, listening to the whirring of the air conditioner and his own erratic heartbeat. It wasn't fear of women. That was the cruelest part. He wasn't afraid of them. He admired them, respected them, wanted to connect, but his brain wouldn't let him. Somewhere in the twisted maze of his subconscious, beauty had become danger. Perfection meant suffocation. Attraction triggered flight. And so he remained trapped in a body that betrayed him, in a world that ridiculed what it didn't understand. He once told his therapist, "It's like being in a glass room. I can see everyone living, laughing, touching, but the moment I try to join them, the walls close in." The therapist just nodded and scribbled something in his notes. Julian stopped going after that. He had millions of followers online, but no one to call when his chest felt too tight to breathe. He had built empires, and yet his soul felt like sand slipping through his fingers. And then came the invitation. A gala, of course. Some new startup wanted his name, his face, his clout. They were launching something trivial, an AI dog walker or smart sunglasses that filtered out bad vibes, whatever that meant. The invite came printed in gold foil. It was addressed to the legendary Julian Cross. He laughed. But his PR team insisted, said it would help shift the narrative, remind people he was still a visionary, not a social recluse with woman issues. Against his better judgment, he agreed. He wore the armor, sleek black tux, sharp watch, stoic expression. He arrived fashionably late, nodded at cameras, sipped from a glass he never intended to drink. He made it 34 minutes before it happened. A voice, honey-sweet, slid behind him. "I've always wanted to meet the man who made drones sexy." He turned. She was stunning. Of course, they always were. Red lips, long lashes, cheekbones carved by ambition. Julian's vision blurred. Sweat prickled his scalp. He reached for the wall. "Are you okay?" she asked, eyes narrowing. He stumbled backward, knocking over a champagne flute. Flashbulbs popped. A hand touched his shoulder. The world tilted. And once again, Julian Cross, the genius, the mogul, the broken man, collapsed in the middle of a party he never wanted to attend. And somewhere in the crowd, someone was already recording. Julian Cross didn't remember hitting the floor. He only remembered the cold, a strange, numbing chill that spread from his chest outward, like someone had cut open his ribcage and let the air in. When he came to, blurry shapes hovered above him, indistinct and glittering under the overhead chandeliers. The gala's ambient music still played softly in the background, the melody absurdly calm compared to the pounding in his skull. "Mr. Cross, can you hear me?" A woman's voice, sharp, professional. Too close. He recoiled instinctively, his hand jerking upward to block her touch. A whisper rippled through the crowd. Phones were out, cameras were rolling. Again. Julian tried to sit up, but the dizziness hit him like a truck. It wasn't just the panic attack this time. It was shame. White-hot and searing. His lungs burned as he forced himself onto his elbows, refusing to be lifted by someone's hands. Not again. Not like some fragile porcelain doll cracked by proximity to a beautiful woman. Security moved in, forming a wall between him and the murmuring sea of spectators, but it was too late. He could already feel the headlines forming in the back of his mind. Julian Cross. The Collapse. Part 2. Or maybe something punchier. The Freak Falls Again. "Julian, are you okay?" came a voice from behind him. Not the concerned kind. The gleeful kind. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Celine Hart. She stepped into his line of vision like a movie villain making her entrance, red dress hugging her figure like a second skin, lips curved in the same smirk she wore on every magazine cover. A camera crew flanked her, their lenses pointed directly at his face. "I was just trying to be friendly," she said, loud enough for her mic to catch. And he collapsed. Again. Her voice was faux sweet, dipped in honey and venom. Julian's jaw clenched. He had heard of Celine before, an influencer turned journalist turned walking scandal factory. She thrived on viral drama and carefully orchestrated chaos. If there was a reputation to ruin or a headline to milk, she was there with her perfect teeth and tailored outrage. She had taken down politicians, CEOs, even a Hollywood actor whose only crime was snubbing her at a party. And now apparently he was her next masterpiece. Julian stood, swaying slightly as his body readjusted to gravity. He stared her down, expression blank. "I don't need this," he muttered. "But," Celine leaned in, lowering her voice just enough to make it intimate for the cameras. "No, but I do. The world is dying for more of you, Julian. The billionaire who breaks at the sight of a pretty face." How poetic. He didn't answer. He just turned and walked out, ignoring the flashes behind him, ignoring the hum of whispers and the echo of her triumphant chuckle. The ride home was silent. His driver, usually chatty, didn't say a word. probably scared, or maybe embarrassed for him. By the time Julian reached his penthouse, the video was already online. It started simple: a grainy shot of the gala floor, a hand extended, a shoulder touched. Then his face. Panicked, pale, sweating, and the stumble. The fall. The gasp. The crowd closing in. Uploaded to TikTok with the caption, "He broke down from a smile. Julian Cross, beauty allergy." The comments were savage. Memes appeared within minutes. Bro saw cleavage and crashed like Windows 98. Julian Cross. Proof money can't buy balls. He needs a hazmat suit to date. Someone call NASA. And then came the think pieces. Op-eds asking whether Julian's condition was real or an elaborate misogynistic metaphor. Podcasters dissected his every movement like body language experts on a crime scene. Therapists speculated publicly about his childhood trauma. Feminists and trolls alike found strange common ground in mocking him. By dawn, the internet had named him again. Julian the Misogynist Cross. And this time, it stuck. He stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, unable to recognize the man looking back. His face looked thinner somehow, more drawn. His eyes were hollow, not with sadness, but exhaustion. He hadn't slept in 2 days. He hadn't spoken to anyone since the gala. His phone had blown up non-stop. Texts, emails, calls. He ignored them all. PR advisors begged him to release a statement. Legal tried to prep a lawsuit. His mother sent a single message: "We warned you this would happen." His father didn't even bother. The board of Crosstech scheduled an emergency meeting. And Celine, she was making the rounds. Morning shows, podcasts, interviews, each one more absurd than the last. She painted herself as the unwitting target of a sexist collapse. Claimed Julian's reaction to her was violent in its psychological rejection. She implied he needed therapy. She called him dangerous in his fragility. And the world listened. Julian sat in silence, his laptop open to one of the interviews. Celine leaned forward, eyes wide with practiced innocence. Maybe he hates women. Maybe he's afraid of them. But either way, he shouldn't be given a platform. Not when he reacts like that to someone simply saying hello. He slammed the laptop shut. The following week was a blur. His company's stock dipped. 2 high-profile partners pulled out of a joint venture. Crosstech's flagship drone project was suspended. Pundits speculated on his mental state. Satirists reenacted the gala collapse on late-night TV with actresses playing overly seductive versions of Celine. Everywhere Julian went, even in his own mind, he was a caricature. He finally agreed to speak with someone not because he wanted to, but because he had no other option. Dr. Ira Mallory, a cognitive psychologist known for dealing with non-standard trauma presentations. The man wore a vest, round glasses, and spoke in the slow, careful tones of someone used to dealing with ticking time bombs. After 2 sessions of silence, Julian finally spoke. "I don't hate women." Dr. Mallory just nodded. "I'm not afraid of them, not in the way people think." "Tell me what it feels like," the doctor said softly. Julian hesitated. "Like my body's on fire. Like I'm choking on air. My brain short circuits. I see them and something in me panics. Not because of them, because of what they represent." "Which is?" "Perfection," Julian whispered. "Expectation. A trap. I'll fail every time." The doctor leaned back. You've internalized the idea that intimacy with beauty is dangerous. That failing in the eyes of someone perfect confirms your worthlessness. Julian nodded slowly. Yeah. Do you want to change that? He looked up, and his voice cracked just a little. More than anything. But therapy was slow, and the world was fast. Every day he woke to more hate, more commentary, more parody. And then the final blow came. Not from the media, but from his own company. The board held a vote. Julian was out. He was no longer fit to lead. The man who founded Crosstech at 19, who turned a college dorm idea into a multi-billion-dollar empire, was ousted from his own creation. They said it was for the good of the shareholders. He sat in the boardroom, numb, as the votes were cast. No one met his eyes. Not even the people he'd hired personally. People he'd trusted. Only one person, his assistant of 5 years, Clara, touched his shoulder gently as he left. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. He returned home, numb to the cold now. He sat on the edge of his bed and stared at nothing for what felt like hours. The silence was thick, oppressive. His chest hurt in that dull, aching way that doesn't go away with breath or time. And in that darkness, one truth rose to the surface. He had lost everything. His company, his reputation, his family, whatever was left of his dignity. And he didn't even know who had started this war against him. Until the next day a package arrived, unmarked, no return address. Inside was a USB drive. Julian plugged it into a separate offline laptop, just in case. What played was grainy surveillance footage from the gala. The angle was from the balcony. It showed Celine approaching him. But before she did, she turned to the cameraman and gave him a thumbs up. She whispered something to her assistant, then mouthed the words, "Now watch this." Julian's hands trembled. The trap had been set long before the party began. He had been played. And now, finally, he had proof. He leaned back in his chair, eyes burning with something he hadn't felt in months. Not shame, not fear, but resolve. Because now it wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about war. The sky above the city was gray the morning Julian Cross disappeared. Not in the literal sense. His penthouse was still guarded by silent security cameras. His name still trended on social media like a curse that refused to fade. But emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, Julian was gone. After weeks of relentless attacks, betrayal, and public shaming, something inside him had finally cracked in a way that couldn't be repaired with time or therapy. He wasn't angry anymore. Anger had burned out like a dying flame. Now there was only a numb, hollow quiet. He turned off his phone, shut down the internet, told his assistant Clara to cancel all appointments indefinitely. Then he did something no one expected. He laughed. No bodyguards, no itinerary, no press. He got in an old, rarely used black Range Rover that had sat in his building's underground garage for years and drove. He didn't know where. Didn't plan. He just let the road carry him, away from everything. The cameras, the cruelty, the gilded cage of power he had once mistaken for freedom. He ended up 4 hours north of the city, somewhere in the rural edges of the state, where the roads narrowed and twisted into forgotten towns. The GPS lost signal, the landscape changed. Brick turned to stone, skyscrapers to forests, cell towers to tall pines. By the time he saw the library, he didn't know why he stopped. Maybe it was instinct, maybe fate. The building sat nestled between a shuttered bakery and a weathered antiques store, its entrance framed by climbing ivy and chipped white columns. A wooden sign above the arched doorway read, "The Ivy Hollow Library." No hours posted. No name under the ownership sign. He stood there for a moment, one hand on the cold brass handle, the wind tugging at the hem of his coat. He hadn't shaved in days, looked nothing like the face that once graced business magazines and Forbes lists. He felt, for the first time in years, anonymous, invisible. He liked it. Inside, the library was dim and hushed. A single desk lamp glowed on the front counter. Bookshelves towered high, casting long shadows across the floor. The air smelled of cedar, paper, and something warm. Cinnamon, maybe. Or gingerbread. No one greeted him. No one stared. It was, strangely, perfect. He wandered aimlessly through the aisles, fingers brushing the spines of books he didn't read. Old classics, foreign novels, poetry collections with covers frayed from decades of handling. There was something comforting about the way the shelves groaned softly under their weight, as if they carried stories that no longer demanded attention, only peace. He found an old leather armchair tucked between two shelves in a quiet corner and sat down. For the first time in weeks, his shoulders relaxed, his lungs expanded. He didn't shake, he didn't sweat, he didn't feel like the floor was going to collapse beneath him. It was just quiet until a voice interrupted it. Most people sit there when they've had enough of the world. It wasn't condescending. It was kind, wry, full of lived-in wisdom. Julian looked up. She stood with a book in her hands, her silver hair pulled back into a loose bun, soft white curls escaping around her temples. Her face was lined, not from bitterness, but from years of smiling, and her eyes, those eyes were sharp, bright, unafraid. "I didn't realize this was your chair," he said quietly. "It's not, but it belongs to people like you." He frowned slightly. "People like me? Ones who carry too much on the inside and pretend it's not heavy." Julian blinked. For a moment he couldn't think of anything to say. Then, with a breath he hadn't meant to let out, he replied, "That's uncomfortably accurate." She smiled and sat down in the armchair opposite his, crossing her legs with the grace of someone who had once danced, perhaps. "You're not from around here?" "No," he said. "You running from something?" "No," he lied. "Then you're the first man in that chair who isn't." He chuckled, a sound foreign to his own ears. It caught him off guard, like someone else had laughed through his mouth. She turned her attention back to the book in her lap and read silently for a few moments, giving him space. He watched her in the quiet, watched the way her hands turned the pages with care, the way her lips moved slightly as she read a particularly beautiful sentence, and for the first time in his adult life, Julian felt completely still in the presence of a woman. No burning skin, no shallow breath, no panic clawing up his throat, just stillness. He didn't even realize he was staring until she glanced up again. "You have a question," she said. Julian cleared his throat. "What are you reading?" "Don Quixote." He raised an eyebrow. "Isn't that the one with the guy who tries to fight windmills?" "That's one way to describe it, but really, it's about a man who sees a world no one else believes in and fights for it anyway." He nodded slowly. "Sounds exhausting." "It is," she said, "but also noble." They sat in silence for a while after that. Eventually she stood. "I'm Eleanor," she said, offering her hand. Julian hesitated just a beat. Then he took it. "Julian." She didn't blink, didn't react, didn't say, "Julian Cross," like most people did. She just nodded once. "It's good to meet you." That night, Julian didn't sleep in a luxury hotel. He found a modest inn a few blocks away from the library. No valet, no concierge, just a small room with a view of an empty park and a heater that clicked every hour. He lay awake, not in anxiety, but in thought. The woman, Eleanor, stayed in his mind. She hadn't asked what he did. She hadn't commented on his face, his scandal, or the world that had tried to break him. She didn't try to fix him, or sympathize, or probe. She simply saw him. The next day, he returned to the library. She was there again, reading in the same chair. She looked up and said, "You're back. I figured I'd give Don Quixote another try." She gestured to the shelves. "He's waitin'." And so it began. Julian returned the day after that, and the next. Days became weeks. He read alongside her, listened to her speak about books the way some people talk about old friends. She never asked about his past, though occasionally she'd make a wry comment that let him know she knew, and chose not to care. She told him stories about forgotten philosophers, about poets who died in obscurity, about her late husband, who had loved her laugh so much that he recorded it on cassette tapes and played them whenever she left the house. He always said my laugh sounded like something about to bloom. Julian found himself listening more than speaking, feeling more than thinking, and as he did, his body stopped betraying him. The reactions that had once crippled him vanished in her presence. She wasn't trying to be beautiful. She simply was. One afternoon, as they sat together during a gentle drizzle outside, Julian broke the silence. "I don't shake when I'm around you." Eleanor didn't look up from her book. "Maybe I'm just old enough to be non-threatening." He chuckled. "That's not it. Then what is it?" He thought for a long time before answering. "You don't expect anything from me." At that, she finally looked at him. "No one should expect anything from anyone," she said. "They should simply witness them." Witness. The word hit him in the chest like a key turning inside a lock that had never opened. That night, Julian didn't return to the inn. He parked his car outside the library long after it closed, just sitting there with his head on the steering wheel, breathing in the scent of old paper still clinging to his sleeves. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a joke. He felt like a person, and that terrified him more than anything. Julian stood outside the Ivy Hollow Library as the last leaves of October fell around him, painting the cobblestone path in amber and gold. His hands were tucked into the pockets of his coat, but his fingers trembled, not from panic, but from something far more dangerous. Comfort. He hadn't had a panic attack in weeks, hadn't flinched at the sound of a woman's voice, or broken into hives at the brush of a hand. If he hadn't had a panic attack in weeks, or broken into hives at the brush of a hand, not once while he sat across from Eleanor, not once while they read in companionable silence. She had become something unspoken, an anchor, something his body didn't fight against. He felt safe, and maybe, just maybe that, terrified him even more. He pushed the thought aside, walking up the worn stone steps. The door creaked open, revealing the warm glow of lamplight. the soft shuffle of pages turning, and Eleanor's quiet hum echoing from the far end of the room. He followed the sound like a moth to flame. But today was different. Eleanor wasn't alone. A shadow moved near her, the distinct silhouette of someone holding a camera. Julian's footsteps stopped mid-stride. There was a woman, young, statuesque, dressed in sharp navy with heels that clicked like gunshots against the old hardwood floor. Her camera was pointed directly at Eleanor, snapping shots from the side. Julian's heart dropped into his stomach. It was Celine Hart. She turned slowly, sensing his presence like a predator recognizing prey. Her red lipstick curled into a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "Well, well," she purred. "Didn't think you'd be hiding in a library." Julian's voice came out low and steady. "Get out!" Celine lowered her camera, but didn't stop smiling. "I figured you'd show up here. You've been off the grid long enough. Your disappearing act only made the world hungrier." He stepped between her and Eleanor. "You need to leave, now." But Eleanor, always poised, placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Julian," she said softly, "what's going on?" Celine's eyes lit up as if Eleanor had just confirmed the juiciest rumor in her arsenal. She pulled out her phone, already tapping the screen. "So it's true," she said, voice dripping with mock affection. "The billionaire has finally found someone he doesn't collapse in front of. And she's... what, 70? Julian's fists clenched. "You're not publishing anything." She showed him her screen. There, in bold font, was a draft headline. "Julian Cross, in love with a grandma. Tragic or touching." He snatched the phone from her, heart thundering. But Celine didn't flinch. "Go ahead," she said with a shrug. "Break it. Throw it in the fireplace. It's already sent. My editors are prepping it as we speak." Julian stared at her. The camera she had used, the smirk she wore, the calculating glint in her eyes. Everything about this was a performance. Another headline, another click, another moment of cruelty dressed as journalism. "This is harassment," he said through gritted teeth. "It's a story," she countered, stepping closer. "And don't pretend you don't love the attention, Julian. You've been feeding off the mystery for years. Now you're just giving the world what they really want. A fairy tale gone sideways." He wanted to scream, to punch something, to drag her out by the arm and protect the one place that had made him feel like a person again. But he didn't. He simply stood, shaking, not from panic, but fury. Celine turned to Eleanor with a faux apologetic smile. "I hope you understand it's nothing personal. People just love a good scandal. And you're part of his now." Then she was gone, her heels clicking against the floor like gunfire fading into the distance. Julian turned back to Eleanor, expecting, he didn't know what. Fear, disgust, disappointment? But all he saw in her face was calm. "I'm sorry," he said hoarsely. She found us. I know," Eleanor interrupted gently. "You don't need to explain. I tried to keep this place safe. To keep you safe. I never asked you to." That stopped him. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. "You came here to escape," she said. "I know that. And I gave you space because I saw something in your eyes. Something I recognized. But Julian, you can't run forever." "I wasn't running," he snapped, too quickly. She gave him a look that stripped him bare. "I was trying," he corrected, quieter. trying to rebuild, to breathe, to be something other than broke. She nodded once. You are trying, but she's not the problem. Not really. He blinked. What? Celine, the press, your father, your company, they're symptoms, not the sickness. Julian sat down, suddenly exhausted. What's a sickness, then? He asked. You don't believe you deserve peace. The words hit him like a knife between the ribs. I didn't do anything wrong, he whispered. I know. So, why do I feel like I ruined everything? Eleanor didn't answer. She just reached into her coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I found this in the back of a poetry book, she said. It's old, but I think it's meant for you. He took it and unfolded it slowly. The poem was brief, just 4 lines. You are not the ruins they call you to be. You are the soil still soft with spring. Let no one tell you what you cannot grow. Only you can name your becoming. His throat closed up. He couldn't speak. I've read hundreds of stories, Eleanor said, her voice soft. But the ones I remember, they're never about perfect people. They're about people who break and choose to rebuild. Julian looked up at her, eyes glistening. But what if I break everything I touch? Then stop touching things to control them, start holding them, to cherish them. He laughed, short, shaky. You always say things like that? Only when someone needs to hear them. That night, the article went live. Celine didn't hold back. The headline read, The Billionaire Falls for 70-year-old Librarian. The untold truth behind Julian Cross's emotional collapse. The body of the article was worse. Twisted quotes, selective screenshots, a photo of Julian and Eleanor, mid-conversation, where he appeared to be gazing at her like a lost soul. Under Celine's lens, it looked almost absurd. A man once terrified of beauty now finds comfort in wrinkles, she wrote. What does that say about him? Or about her? The internet erupted. The memes returned with vengeance. From model chasers to grandma lovers, Julian never fails to surprise. This man's dating range goes from Playboy to Social Security. New kink unlocked. Geriatric romance. Julian didn't look at most of it. But Eleanor did. And that's what hurt the most. 3 days later, he returned to the library. It was boarded up, vandalized. Freak was spray-painted across the stone. Windows shattered, books scattered on the ground inside, barely visible through the broken glass. Julian's chest constricted. He ran to the door and banged on it. Eleanor? No answer. He asked the cafe owner across the street, who only shook his head. She left yesterday. Said she was going away for a while, somewhere quiet. Where? I don't know. She didn't say. Julian stood frozen in the street as rain began to fall. The Ivy Hollow Library, his sanctuary, now looked like a crime scene. He had tried to protect her, to shield her from the chaos of his world, and still they came for her. The media hadn't just destroyed him this time. They'd taken her too. He drove all night, but not toward the city. Not this time. He didn't stop at hotels or check his phone. He didn't speak to Clara or Ramon or anyone on his staff. He just drove, because he had no home anymore. The only place that had ever felt like one was gone. Julian Cross didn't sleep that night. After finding the Ivy Hollow Library in shambles and Eleanor gone without a trace, He wandered aimlessly through unfamiliar roads and forgotten towns. The rain had followed him like a curse, tapping softly against the windshield, fogging the glass until he could barely see. Somewhere past midnight, he pulled over on the shoulder of a narrow country road and just sat there. The silence in the car was a suffocating vacuum. No music, no navigation voice, not even the hum of a city in the distance. He stared into the dark woods lining the road, the trees swaying like shadows, whispering secrets to each other. His hands were clamped tightly around the steering wheel, but they weren't guiding him anymore. They were holding him together. The rain intensified, blurring the windshield into streaks of distortion. It mirrored the chaos in his mind, memories crashing over him like thunder. Eleanor's smile, her laugh, the way her eyes danced when she talked about forgotten poets, the smell of cedar and worn books, the soft scrape of her chair as she shifted in that quiet library corner. God, all of it. Not because she chose to leave, but because he had brought destruction to the only thing in his life that had ever felt real. His breath caught. Something inside him folded inward. Maybe she's better off, he thought. Maybe everyone is. He hadn't cried when he lost his company, or when his father disowned him, or when the world turned him into a living meme. But now, alone on a back road with the rain pounding and no one left to call, tears slipped down his cheeks, quiet, raw, unannounced. He reached for his phone, not even sure why. His thumb hovered over the screen before finally pressing the only contact he hadn't yet burned. Ramon. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Then, finally, the familiar voice answered. "Sir?" Julian's voice cracked. "She's gone." There was a pause on the other end. "I know," Ramon said gently. "I saw the library this morning. It's horrible." Julian nodded, even though no one could see him. "I should have never gone there. I brought this on her." "That's not true. She left because of me." "She left because she thought it would protect you," Ramon said. "But she didn't vanish completely." Julian straightened. "Well, I found something," Ramon said. "It took some digging, but I called in a favor. She's at a small monastery outside Portland. Secluded, no press. They take in people who want silence." Julian's heart punched against his ribs. "Is she safe?" "As far as I know," Ramon replied. Then, more softly, "She told them she didn't want to be found. Said she needed to disappear before she ruined someone else's life." Julian closed his eyes. Those words, they shattered him. "Give me the address," he whispered. The rain hadn't stopped by the time he reached the Oregon border. Fog draped over the hills like a veil, and the pine trees closed in tighter around him as the elevation rose. He drove for hours, the winding roads narrow and barely lit, but he didn't stop. Not for food, not for rest. His hands were numb, his eyes hollow, but something deeper, stronger, kept the engine running. By the time he reached the monastery, dawn was just breaking, staining the horizon in pale gray light. The building sat atop a hill, modest and quiet, surrounded by low stone walls and towering trees. A rusted iron gate creaked as he pushed it open, and a single path led up to a wooden door carved with a simple cross. He knocked. Footsteps approached, slow and measured. The door opened to reveal a woman in a plain habit, her expression serene but cautious. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm looking for Eleanor Shaw," Julian said, voice rough. The nun's brow furrowed. "We don't take visitors." Please, he whispered. Just tell her I'm here. She hesitated, then nodded and slipped inside, leaving Julian standing in the cold mist. Minutes passed. Then the door opened again. But this time the nun's expression was apologetic. She said, "She doesn't want to see you." Julian staggered back a step. "No," he said, barely above a whisper. "Please, just let me talk to her. She asked that you respect her wish for peace," the nun said gently. "She believes staying in your life would only cause you more pain." The door closed. He stood there for a long time, motionless, the fog thickening around him like grief made tangible. His knuckles were white where they gripped the iron gate. His breath came out in ragged, silent shudders. Then he turned, walked slowly back to his car, and sat in the driver's seat. He didn't start the engine, didn't move. Just sat there. He couldn't cry again. He had nothing left. Hours passed. The sky shifted from gray to gold to dusk. When he finally turned on the ignition, he didn't know where to go. There was nowhere left. No company, no family, no home. Not even the small corner of the world he'd carved out for himself among dusty bookshelves and warm smiles. For the first time, the thought of death didn't frighten him. If I disappear, it all stops. No more scandal, no more whispers, no more waking up with a weight in his chest so heavy he couldn't breathe. He drove again. No direction, no plan. The road twisted up a mountain, narrow and slick from the rain. The cliffside dropped away to his left, sheer and hungry. The thought crept in slowly, like a fog behind his eyes. All it takes is a little pressure on the pedal. He could end it, quietly. No farewell, no note, just let the car slide off the road into silence. No one would miss him. His parents had cut him off. His friends had abandoned him. The world had turned him into a cautionary tale. And Eleanor? She didn't want him anymore. Not really. So what was the point? He tightened his grip on the wheel, his foot hovering near the gas pedal. The wind howled outside, shaking the car gently, as if nature herself was urging him on. Then, suddenly, his phone rang. He flinched, startled. The screen lit up in the darkness. Ramon. He stared at it. Then, almost against his own will, he answered. "Sir?" Ramon's voice was urgent, strained. "Where are you?" Julian didn't reply. "Please, talk to me." There was a long silence. Then Julian whispered, "I'm on a mountain road. I don't think I want to keep going." Ramon's breath caught. "Listen to me, Julian. You are not alone. I know it feels like it right now, but you're not." Julian closed his eyes. "She doesn't want to see me." "She's scared," Ramon said. "She thinks she's protecting you. She's the only one who ever saw me as human. And that's exactly why she matters," Ramon said. "You can't let this destroy you. Not after everything. Not after what you've survived." Julian's hands trembled. "What's the point if everyone thinks I'm a freak?" "Then show them who you really are," Ramon said, his voice steady. "Take back your story. Don't let Celine win. Don't let the world tell you who you are." Julian's breathing slowed. "I don't know how," he admitted. "You start by choosing not to die tonight," Ramon said. "Start there." Julian stared ahead at the darkness. Then, slowly, he pulled his foot away from the gas. and the car remained on the road. He drove back down the mountain before dawn. The sky lightened in soft gradients of blue and gold. When he returned to his penthouse, it was empty and cold, but no longer unbearable. He stood in the center of the living room, staring at the skyline, the city stretching out beneath him like a second chance. He'd failed before, but maybe he still had time to fight. Not just for Eleanor, but for himself. The sky over Manhattan shimmered with morning haze when Julian Cross stepped into his penthouse for the first time in weeks. The silence that once suffocated him now felt like a battlefield awaiting his return. Dust lay in soft sheets over the marble countertops. The air inside was stale and indifferent. Nothing in the room had changed, yet everything inside him had. He dropped his keys onto the kitchen counter with a heavy clatter, shrugged off his coat, and stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city stretched below like a machine that had chewed him up and spat him out. Only now, he wasn't running from it. He was going to fight it. He stood there for a long while, watching the city breathe, until a familiar knock tapped against the door. Julian opened it to find Ramon standing there, holding a thermos of coffee and a bag of bagels, his face a complicated mix of relief and worry. "I figured you might need breakfast," he said softly. Julian didn't say anything at first, just stepped aside and let him in. Ramon placed the food on the table and turned to face him. "I'm glad you're still here." Julian nodded. "So am I." They sat at the table, silence stretching between them until Julian finally spoke. "I don't want to hide anymore," he said, "and I don't want Eleanor hiding either." Ramon raised his eyebrows slightly. "You're going back for her?" Julian shook his head. "I already tried. She wouldn't see me. So, what are you going to do?" Julian leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling for a moment. "I'm going to make sure the world knows the truth." Ramon gave a slow nod. "Then we'll need help." Julian already knew who he needed. He spent the next few hours drafting an email. It wasn't addressed to a lawyer or a PR firm. It was addressed to Ava Lynn. Ava wasn't just a journalist. She was the journalist, respected, relentless, and famously immune to bribes or influence. She had built a career out of destroying false narratives and exposing media manipulation. Julian had crossed paths with her once at a charity event. She'd asked a question about drone ethics, and he'd answered honestly. She'd called him brilliant but overly insulated. At the time, it stung. Now, it felt like prophecy. He poured himself into the email, every detail, every moment, from the first panic attack to Celine's ambush at the gala. He included screenshots, timestamps, even the footage Ramon had uncovered of Celine setting him up. Then he hit send. For hours, nothing. Then, just after sunset, Ava replied, "I'm in. Come to my office tomorrow at 8 a.m. Bring everything." Julian barely slept. When he arrived the next morning, Ava's office was already buzzing. She was seated at her desk, glasses perched low on her nose, her fingers dancing across her laptop keyboard like they were sparring with the truth. She looked up as he entered. "Cross." He nodded. "Lynn." She gestured to the chair across from her. "Tell me everything, again, in your words, no fluff." And he did. He told her about his condition, about the gala, the viral video, the second collapse, the Ivy Hollow Library, Eleanor, and the smear campaign that followed. Ava listened without interrupting once, her face unreadable, occasionally jotting down notes in her leather-bound notebook. When he finished, her gaze was sharp. "You're sitting on a gold mine. This isn't about revenge," Julian said firmly. "I don't want Celine destroyed. I want the truth out. I want the world to understand what it did to me, and to Eleanor." Ava nodded. "Then we do it my way. Full transparency, receipts, witnesses, no emotional spin." Agreed. The next 72 hours moved at a blistering pace. Ava brought in a small investigative team. Ramon helped pull Julian's old correspondences, footage, and medical records. Clara, his former assistant, offered a sworn statement, verifying that Celine had requested access to Julian's itinerary weeks before the gala under false pretenses. A former producer at Celine's news agency, disgruntled and recently fired, leaked emails showing Celine mocking Julian's condition and planning to bait him for the perfect viral reaction. Julian recorded a private interview with Ava. Just him and the camera, no edits. No script. "I'm not afraid of women," he said, looking directly into the lens. "I'm afraid of not being seen as a human being." Then he paused. "But there was one person who never treated me like a spectacle. She never asked about my money. She never Googled me. She only ever asked about what I was reading. Her name is Eleanor Shaw, and she reminded me that I am more than the worst thing the internet has ever said about me." The video was scheduled to go live alongside Ava's expose. Julian watched the countdown from his penthouse, his laptop open on the table beside a cold cup of coffee. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The article dropped. "The Making of a Monster: How Media Created and Crucified Julian Cross." It was a masterwork, clear, factual, and blistering. It included Celine's emails, the audio from the gala prep, statements from Crosstech executives who admitted they were pressured to distance themselves from Julian for optics. The interview was embedded halfway down the article. Within an hour, it had over 2 million views. By noon, it was trending globally. By evening, it had sparked an avalanche. Celine Hart released a statement calling the article a fabricated hit piece, but public opinion had already shifted. Her network suspended her, pending an internal investigation. Sponsors dropped her within days. Former colleagues flooded the internet with stories of her behavior, how she'd manipulated stories, staged emotional moments, and silenced anyone who questioned her. Julian, meanwhile, was quiet. He didn't go on talk shows, didn't tweet, didn't gloat. He waited. 3 days after the article dropped, he returned to the monastery. The same nun answered the door, but this time her expression softened the moment she saw him. "She's been reading the article," she said. "Every word. Can I see her?" The nun hesitated, then nodded. "She's in the garden." Julian followed the narrow path behind the monastery, where rows of lavender and rosemary lined the stone walls. There, seated on a weathered bench, was Eleanor. Her hair was pulled back. Her hands rested in her lap, and her eyes, they met his without surprise. "You came back," she said. He approached slowly. "I never left, not really." She gave a faint smile. "You didn't try to defend yourself. I wanted the truth to do it for me. And me? I didn't fight for the world's approval," he said. "I fought so I could stand in front of you and say I tried." A long silence stretched between them. The wind stirred the lavender. "I read everything," she said. "I watched the interview." He waited. She looked down at her hands. "I was afraid. I thought if I stayed, I'd become the reason you were mocked again." Julian stepped forward, lowering himself onto the bench beside her. They mocked me because I let them, he said. I didn't speak. I let people like Celine tell my story. And now I speak for myself. Eleanor looked at him, eyes shining just slightly. And what does your story say? That I love a woman who saw me before anyone else did, who didn't care about the money, the mess, or the headlines. Her lips quirked. That sounds dangerous. It is, he said. But I'm not afraid anymore. She reached out and took his hand. For the first time, he didn't flinch, and this time, she didn't have to let go. Julian Cross stepped into the courtroom with a calmness that surprised even him. The world outside was still on fire, cameras flashing, reporters yelling questions, people debating on every platform whether he was a victim or a mastermind. But inside, he felt strangely grounded. There was no script for this moment, no PR consultant whispering in his ear, no team of stylists making sure he looked appropriately humble. He wore a simple gray suit. His hair was longer than before, slightly unkempt, and his face bore the weight of a man who had seen too much, but still chose to show up. As he entered the courtroom, a hush fell over the crowd. All eyes turned to him, not with mockery this time, but with curiosity, even hesitation. People didn't know what to make of him anymore. He had gone from tech prodigy to national joke to symbol of media abuse, all in the span of a year. And now he was the plaintiff in the most high-profile defamation case the country had seen in decades. Jean Hart sat at the defendant's table, flanked by her high-powered legal team. She wore a crisp navy suit, her signature red lipstick intact, her jaw tight. But her eyes betrayed her nerves. She had always thrived on control, over narratives, over public perception, over the truth itself. But here, in this courtroom, she was no longer the one dictating the story. Julian took his seat beside his lawyer, Christopher Gates, a man as sharp as broken glass and twice as dangerous. Gates was known in elite circles as the Wall. Nothing got past him. He didn't care about headlines or applause. He cared about facts, about truth, and about winning. When the judge entered and the gavel struck, the trial began. Gates stood first. Your Honor, this is not just a case about reputation. It's a case about manipulation, about the deliberate, calculated destruction of a man's life for clicks, views, and personal gain. He walked slowly across the courtroom, his voice steady. My client, Julian Cross, was ridiculed by the entire world after a series of videos and articles falsely portrayed him as unstable, misogynistic, and unfit for public respect. But behind those viral moments was a journalist who twisted facts, staged encounters, and weaponized perception. Gates turned to the jury. We will prove that Miss Hart didn't report a story, she manufactured one. Then it was the defense's turn. Celine's lawyer, Veronica Dames, rose with practiced poise. Ladies and gentlemen, she said with a soft smile, my client is a respected journalist. She merely reported what she saw. A man who, in public, collapsed at the touch of a woman. A man who, by his own admission, has a psychological condition related to intimacy. Are we now punishing journalists for telling the truth? Julian stared straight ahead, refusing to react. He knew the defense would try to frame this as censorship, as an attack on freedom of the press, but this wasn't about free speech. This was about the abuse of it. The first witness was Clara, his former assistant. She took the stand, composed but firm. Yes, she said. Miss Hart reached out to me weeks before the gala. She asked for Julian's appearance schedule, said it was for a neutral piece on tech moguls attending charity events. She was very charming. Persuasive. I had no idea she planned to ambush him. Did she mention the potential for viral content? Gates asked. Clara nodded. She said, "If he cracks even a little, it's gold." I thought she was joking. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Next came the footage. The raw video from the gala's security cameras. The jury watched as Celine was seen signaling her cameraman before approaching Julian. They saw her nod to her assistant, mouthing, "Now." Gates let the silence hang. "Does that look like journalism?" he asked, "or entrapment?" Veronica objected, but the damage was done. Over the next few days, the courtroom became a theater of truths long buried. Former colleagues of Celine came forward, testifying about her history of bending facts, of staging emotional interviews, of editing reality to fit a narrative. One particularly damning moment came when a producer from Celine's network revealed internal emails between her and the editorial staff. "She called Julian the Golden Goose," the producer said. "She said if she could keep the story going, it would anchor a documentary series. There were talks of a book deal. She wasn't reporting, she was building a brand off his pain." The final blow came when Gates played an audio recording, leaked anonymously, of Celine bragging at a private media party. "I made the world believe a billionaire was allergic to beauty," she said, laughing, "and then I gave them their twist ending, grandma romance. It's genius, really." Celine's face paled. The jury sat in stunned silence. Julian watched without blinking. When he finally took the stand, there was no dramatic speech, no tears, just quiet conviction. "I never asked to be famous," he said. "I never asked for pity. All I ever wanted was to be understood." He glanced at the jury. "I have a real condition, one that has affected my life in ways most people can't imagine. But instead of support or compassion, I became a punchline. Not because of what I did, but because of how someone chose to frame me." He took a deep breath. "She didn't just hurt me. She hurt the people who tried to care about me. She made a kind, gentle woman into a target of national ridicule. She turned a story of healing into one of mockery. And for what? Views? Engagement?" He looked down at his hands. "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here so that this doesn't happen to someone else." When he stepped down, the courtroom was silent. The deliberation took only 4 hours. When the jury returned, their verdict was clear. "We find the defendant, Celine Hart, guilty of defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and character assassination." The judge's sentence was swift. Celine was ordered to pay $5 million in damages, issue a public apology, and was barred from practicing journalism for 5 years. She stood frozen as the courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Her career, once untouchable, lay in ashes. Julian didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply exhaled. Outside the courthouse, the press swarmed him. Microphones, questions, cameras. "Do you feel vindicated? Will you return to Crosstech? Where's Eleanor Shaw?" Julian raised a hand for silence. The crowd quieted. "I didn't do this for vindication," he said. "I did it for truth. For the people who have been broken by narratives they couldn't control. For the ones who've been mocked for being different." He paused, his gaze steady. "And most of all, I did it for the woman who stood by me when the world laughed." Then he walked away. That night, he returned to his penthouse and stood in front of the same window where this all began. But he no longer saw the city as a battlefield. He saw it as a place waiting to be reimagined. He made a call. The number rang once before Eleanor answered. "You saw it?" he asked. "I did." There was a pause. Then her voice, warm and quiet. "You stood up for both of us." "I stood up for myself," he said. "Because you believed I could." She said nothing, but he heard the softest catch in her breath. "I'd like to see you," he said. Another pause. "Then come find me," she whispered. And for the first time in a very long time, Julian smiled. The air in New York carried a different weight 3 days after the trial ended. The city still pulsed with its usual rhythm, sirens, traffic, people shouting into cell phones. But something had shifted in the way the headlines moved. Julian Cross was no longer a laughingstock, no longer a symbol of scandal. He was something rarer, more fragile. A man who had been broken and had clawed his way back, not with noise, but with truth. But even in victory, Julian felt hollow. He stood in front of the courthouse steps long after the reporters had left, the marble cool beneath his shoes, his mind thousands of miles away. Not on the trial, not on the damages Celine Hart had been ordered to pay, not even on the media's sudden swing toward sympathy. He was thinking about Eleanor, thinking about the garden behind the monastery, the way she had looked at him, not like a headline, not like a problem, but like a man. He'd fought for her dignity, her peace. But when the verdict came down, she hadn't been in the crowd. She hadn't called, she hadn't come. He couldn't blame her. For months, he'd been a whirlwind of lawsuits and media noise. Maybe she didn't want to be dragged into another chapter. Maybe she'd given him everything she had already. Her kindness, her presence, her belief. And now she was retreating for good. But then, as he stepped through the security gate and toward the waiting car, he saw her. Eleanor? She stood across the street in a gray coat, her silver hair pinned back, a soft scarf wrapped around her neck. Her eyes met his the way they always had. Gently, curiously, like he was a page she wanted to reread again and again. He froze. She stepped forward, weaving through traffic like time had slowed just for them. When she reached him, neither of them spoke for a moment. They just stood there, two people who had survived the storm. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, voice low. "I was waiting," she said, "for you to stop fighting ghosts." His throat tightened. Did I? She nodded. "You did." He took a breath. "I don't want this to end in a courtroom. I don't want our story to be about survival. I want it to be about something more." Eleanor tilted her head. "Like what?" "Like choosing each other." She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Would you like to do something crazy with me?" he asked suddenly, the same line he'd rehearsed in his mind 100 times. She laughed, quiet, rich, genuine. What could be crazier than everything we've already been through? He grinned, leaving it all behind. And that's exactly what they did. A week later, Julian and Eleanor packed 2 small bags and vanished into the quiet corners of the country. They drove south, trading skyscrapers for open roads, media scrutiny for the sound of wind rustling through cornfields. In San Diego, they rented a small car and wandered through seaside towns. No one recognized them. No one asked questions. At night, they sat on porches, watching the stars blink above the desert. In the mornings, they shared coffee at roadside diners, reading the paper like ordinary people. "Did you ever imagine this life?" Eleanor asked one morning as they watched a street performer play flamenco guitar on a sunlit corner. Not in a million years, Julian said. But now I can't imagine anything else. Eleanor sipped her coffee. Happiness isn't found in headlines or high-rises. It's here, in the pauses. Julian reached across the table and touched her hand, no longer fearing the brush of skin, no longer flinching from intimacy. He had changed. She had changed him. Days bled into weeks, and eventually they found a small town nestled against the hills of North Carolina. Quiet. Warm. The kind of place where people greeted you by name after one visit. They rented a modest 2-bedroom house on the edge of a forest trail and filled it with books, art, music, and silence. It was nothing like Julian's old life, and it was everything he never knew he needed. He didn't check social media. He didn't Google himself. He didn't care how the public had reframed his story. He was done chasing narratives. But something still stirred in him, a desire not for revenge or even recognition, but for purpose. One morning, as they sat by the fire, Julian turned to Eleanor and said, "I want to build something." She raised an eyebrow. "Another company?" He shook his head. "A foundation. For people like me, people who've been ridiculed for things they couldn't control, for those whose truth was twisted into entertainment." Eleanor smiled. "Then let's do it." 3 months later, back in New York, Julian launched the Resilience Project, a nonprofit aimed at supporting individuals who had suffered from public shaming, media harassment, and social exile. He used every dollar of his personal fortune to fund the initiative, refusing donations, refusing any attempt to profit off the pain. At the launch press conference, he stood behind the podium, Eleanor seated quietly in the front row. "I was once a man who thought power made me safe," he said. "Then I lost everything and found that truth is far stronger. I don't want anyone else to feel what I felt, like their story isn't theirs to tell. So we're building a place where people can reclaim their narratives, where no one is mocked for being different, where healing isn't just a buzzword, it's a mission." Applause erupted. Even the press, once his harshest critics, nodded in quiet agreement. He didn't stay long after the event. He walked off stage, took Eleanor's hand, and disappeared back into their little world. Because applause didn't matter anymore. What mattered was her. What mattered was peace. Months passed. The world moved on. New scandals replaced old ones. Julian Cross became less a name and more a quiet legacy. A man who had been broken, humiliated, and risen with grace. Celine Hart, meanwhile, faded. Her name became synonymous with reckless ambition. Her media ban stripped her of power. Her apology, public and forced, rang hollow, and few came to her defense. One rainy afternoon, Julian sat in a small cafe in Manhattan, waiting for Eleanor to finish browsing a used bookstore nearby. As he sipped his coffee, he saw someone sitting alone in the far corner. Celine. Her eyes were dull, her posture hunched. No entourage, no lipstick. Just a woman who had flown too close to the sun and fallen hard. She looked up and saw him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she stood and walked over, hesitant. "Are you here to gloat?" she asked. Julian shook his head. No. Her mouth tightened. "I lost everything, you know." "I know." She hesitated again. "Do you think people like us can ever really come back from something like that?" He studied her for a long moment. I think people come back when they stop trying to be who they were and start becoming who they need to be. She looked down at her hands. I was wrong. Julian nodded. Yes, but that doesn't mean you can't choose something better. She didn't respond. He didn't wait for her to. When Eleanor returned, rain clinging to her coat, she slipped her arm through his, and they stepped back out into the street, together. Later that year, they returned to the Ivy Hollow Library. The windows had been repaired, the walls repainted. It had reopened under a new caretaker, a young woman named Hannah, who greeted them with soft eyes and a reverent smile. I heard what you did, she said to Julian. You turned the ugliest story into something beautiful. Julian smiled. I had help. He and Eleanor sat in their old chairs, now lovingly restored. She opened a worn book of poetry. He listened to her read. The sun poured through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the floor. He looked at her, not with hunger, not with fear, but with peace. If there's another life after this one, he whispered, I hope we meet in a place just like this. Eleanor closed the book, her hand slipping into his. Then let's make this one count. And in that moment, as the world outside carried on, loud, fast, unforgiving, inside the quiet sanctuary of a library filled with stories and second chances, Julian Cross finally, fully came home. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of Julian and Eleanor's story. If you're still here, it means you believe, like we do, that even the most broken hearts can find healing, and that true connection defies judgment, age, and appearance. This story reminds us that no matter how far someone falls, they can rise again, not with noise or pride, but with truth, vulnerability, and the courage to fight for what matters. We all carry silent battles. Some are mocked for their differences, others shamed for their pain. But if there's one lesson here, it's this. You are not defined by your darkest moment. You are defined by what you choose to do after it. Now we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your country or city in the comments below so we can see how far this story has reached. And if this story touched you in any way, please consider subscribing. We share powerful stories like this every week, and we'd love for you to be part of this growing community of hope and humanity. Until next time, stay kind, stay brave, and never stop believing in second chances.